Hello students, welcome to your American Revolution lecture. This goes over the period of time between 1763 and 1783 and is lecture 3. So to start this lecture, let's talk about for a minute the colonial relationship in 1763. Now at this period, there were no colonials who felt they were being horribly mistreated. There were no Americans yet in the colonies. If anything, there were Virginians or New Yorkers, but typically people considered themselves Englishmen or English colonials. They recognized the mother country had certain powers, such as to regulate trade and decide on matters of war and peace. And they too believed they had certain rights. They believed they had the power to tax themselves, and that made them the most free colonials in the world at the time. However, in a 12-year period between 1763 and 1775, their relationship that had worked for over 100 years fell apart. Therefore, there are two important questions to ask before we look at our American Revolution lecture. Question number 1. Between 1763 and 1775, what were the causes of that breakdown in the relationship between England and her colonies? How did their working relationship break down? Second question. Between 1775 and 1783, what changes did the revolutionaries enact when they gained their independence? Typically, a revolution is supposed to be a violent upheaval of the status quo. So what did the American Revolution change? Now, beginning in 1754, so we're going back a little bit, there were skirmishes between British colonists, the French, and Indians in western Pennsylvania that erupted into a world war. North America became the focus of British and French aims, and the cause of war between these two great empires. This conflict transformed North America politically and socially. Victory would make Britain the dominant power in eastern North America and sparked new tensions between imperial officials, colonists, and Indians. This war was centered in the Ohio Valley region, where power had been balanced between the British, the French, the Iroquois Indians, and Indians of the Great Lakes region. Immigration to British North America and colonial expansion had pushed Indians into the Ohio Valley. They had been pushed further and further west. Now in 1744, the Iroquois ceded claims to the Ohio Valley to the colony of Virginia. This happened with the Treaty of Lancaster. So again, the Iroquois ceded claims, gave up claims to the Ohio Valley to Virginia. And by early 1745, Virginia had granted over 300,000 acres to a group of planters called the Ohio Company of Virginia. Traders and surveyors moved into the area and began trading with the Indians, offering a wider array of goods at better prices than the French had. The French reacted negatively to British attempting to take control of the area, as the Ohio River linked Quebec, Illinois, and Louisiana to one another, which is basically connecting the French area of North America. So if the British gained control of the Ohio River, that would cut French North America in half. So the French asserted their influence in a couple of ways. The first way the French asserted their influence was through diplomacy, French and Indian diplomacy. The French distributed trade goods to recruit Indian allies from the Great Lakes to attack Indians with ties to traders bearing British goods. So the French used their influence to rile up Indians in the area. In addition, the French built a chain of forts in order to halt British encroachment. The most important of these forts was Fort Duquesne, which you see sort of in the middle left side of that slide. This is where today's Pittsburgh would be. And Fort Duquesne was completed in 1754. These forts caused panic with British colonists and imperial officials. So, in June of 1754, representatives of 7 colonies and the Iroquois met at Albany, New York, in order to keep the Iroquois from siding with the French and to coordinate a defense. This is known as the Albany Congress. The Albany Congress. And they persuaded the Iroquois to stay with the British, but they were less successful at uniting the colonial governments. One future founding father that was present at this early Congress was Benjamin Franklin. Now, George Washington, at the time, was a young planter from Virginia. He had interest in the Ohio Company. He was promoted to the rank of lieutenant colonel by Virginia's government and given command of 200 men with the task of building Fort Necessity. Now, at this time, Washington had very little military experience. He was given poorly trained soldiers to work with. Fort Necessity was supposed to shadow Fort Duquesne, and Fort Necessity was just to the south of Fort Duquesne, and it was meant to block the way to Maryland and Virginia. Well, Washington was not a great diplomat with the Indians, and most of the Indians in the area sided with the French. Also, the British had thousands of land-hungry colonists that seemed to pose a greater threat to the Indians than the French did. In July of 1754, a combination of French and Indian forces overran Fort Necessity, killing 30 men. The humiliated survivors, including George Washington, trudged east as French soldiers torched what remained of the British claims in the Ohio Valley. This was the start of the French and Indian War. Now, I'm not going to focus on many battles of this war, so just know that for the first 3 years, the war went really badly for Britain and her colonies. However, the tide of the war began to change in 1758 because the French began to lose their Indian allies. Now, initially, Indians were used by the French to raid British colonies and to force them to seek peace. At Fort William Henry, which you see up in the top right, a force of nearly 2,000 Indians helped the French besiege the fort. After the fort surrendered, the French did not allow their Indian allies to take any of the surrendered firearms, which angered the Indians and led them to kill 200 soldiers and camp followers and capture hundreds. This incident caused large damage between the French and their Indian allies, and ultimately the Great Lake Indian warriors would not heed French requests for help in large numbers ever again. Another move toward British victory in North America was due to the tens of thousands of colonists who took up arms for the British. By 1758, they comprised almost half of the nearly 50,000 men who British commanders sent into battle. Additionally, the British military advantage in North America arose from differences in how the English and French had colonized North America. Massive immigration, high birth rates, and intensive resettlement of Indian lands gave the British a much larger potential fighting force in North America than the French. France counted and needed Indian allies to make up the difference in troop numbers. So once most Indians abandoned the war, British victory was only a matter of time. The war dragged on until the Treaty of Paris in 1763. After this, the British were the dominant European power in North America and the West Indies, and seemed on their way to becoming the world's mightiest empire. So this slide here shows you what the holdings looked like in the colonies before the Treaty of Paris, before the French and Indian War. And as you can see French holdings were massive, right? Massive. And Great Britain was mostly on the eastern side. And then you see the Spanish down in Florida. So, the thing that led to the American Revolution was a total military victory by Great Britain. After the Treaty of Paris in 1763, the British had achieved a complete victory that drove the French virtually off the continent. Now check out this slide. Although the British were successful, by the end of all these wars, they had more than doubled their national debt. This created 3 new problems for the British Empire that led to the American Revolution. First of all, trade regulations. The colonists were still breaking the Navigation Acts whenever and wherever they could. Evasion by American merchants and corruption among custom officers was rampant. The British realized they were actually spending more money trying to stop cheating than they were earning from the Navigation Acts. Also, during the French and Indian War, the British discovered that colonials were actually trading with the French, which was a huge violation of their duties as Englishmen. So the period of salutary neglect in the enforcement of the Navigation Acts was rapidly coming to an end. So when the French were driven out after the war, it opened up all the territory west of the Appalachian Mountains, and the colonials wanted to move into these regions immediately to exploit the land. However, there was a problem. There were already people living out there, right? There were Indians there. So when the French were there, they just wanted to trade with the natives. They weren't trying to take the land. But the British, in contrast, wanted to take the land. Also, the Indians that had sided with the French in the war lost a lot of land in the Treaty of Paris, and so there was a lot of hostility and lack of understanding. So as the colonials moved westward and encroached on the natives' lands, there was an Ottawa chief. The Ottawa chief said that if you allow the English among you, you are dead. So he organized and launched a pan-tribal assault against the Anglos, and this is called Pontiac's Rebellion or Pontiac's War, which began in 1763. Now, Pontiac's Rebellion or War lasted around 3 years, and when it ended 3 years later, around 2,500 British soldiers and settlers had been killed or captured, and 200 Indians killed. Now the British, not wanting to have to pay for troops to stay out west, but wanting to protect the colonists, created something called the Proclamation Line of 1763. Now this was in a direct response to Pontiac's Rebellion, and it said that English colonials could not settle in land west of the Appalachian Mountains. They could not settle in land west of the Appalachian Mountains. This really upset the colonists. They said it was the English government protecting the Indians over their own citizens. English colonists would have much preferred an extermination approach. The Proclamation Line, however, does not actually stop the settlers from moving west, but it does anger them. Now, the third one there, debt and taxes, that was probably the most important part for the colonists. During the French and Indian War, the British spent themselves to death. It was a very expensive war. Their national debt doubled. So believing they had to deal with their debt, they raised taxes. Now they were already taxing the people in England proper incredibly high. So naturally they decided they should tax the colonists. especially since this war that was so expensive had been fought for the colonists' benefit. They believed that the colonists should share in that financial burden. So at this point, the Revenue Act of 1764 was passed. The Revenue Act of 1764. This was the first time the British used custom duties to earn money from the colonists. Not just to regulate trade, but to earn money from the colonist. Now that said, the Revenue Act didn't bother the colonists too much because they were still dealing with issues of commerce and custom duties, which the colonists believed was the purview of the English government. However, when the British government passed the Stamp Act of 1765, all hell broke loose. This was, and this is important, this was the first direct internal tax placed on the colonists. It said that all paper products, such as legal documents, newspapers, pamphlets, bonds, leases, deeds, insurance policies, playing cards, all paper products had to have an official stamp. And this stamp would be bought from a British administrator. So this was going to affect the wealthiest and the most articulate elements of society, right? Those are the men who deal with those sort of paper products for the most part. These are men that are merchants, planters, lawyers, editors, all strategically placed to influence public opinion. Now, even though England had a Stamp Act that they had put on people in England that was much heavier than the one in America was going to be, the colonists reacted furious to this. And they responded in 3 different ways. First of all, they had what we call polite protest. Resolutions were passed in almost each of the colonial legislatures against the Stamp Act. A delegation was held in New York called the Stamp Act Congress in 1765. They said here, no taxation without representation. You can see in this slide simply the newspapers posted a lot of different cartoons in response to the Stamp Act. So the Stamp Act Congress said no taxation without representation. And you've probably heard that before, but it's very important to know the context of those words to understand the full quote. And that's what I have on the slide for you. So the full quote was, "We will give all due subordination to Parliament, but we do not accept taxation without representation." Now that means something a little bit different than what we've often been told, right? They are still claiming that they are English citizens. They are still subordinating themselves to Parliament, and that's important to understand. So what their problem was that the colonials were not represented in Parliament. So because of that, they said they could not be taxed. Also, there were boycotts. They stopped buying British goods. They thought this would hurt British manufacturing and trade so much that they would in turn put pressure on the British government to repeal the Stamp Act. And then there was also mob violence. This was particularly true in Boston. In that city, they hung an effigy of Boston's stamp agent from a tree. They carried it through the streets. They destroyed the stamp office. They burned the effigy. And they also created some damage on the house of the lieutenant governor and the local customs officer. So what were the British government's options here? They could back down and repeal the Stamp Act, or they could use the entire British military to enforce it. Well, in 1765, the government backed down, partly because of pressure from British merchants, and ultimately, no colonial ever paid anything for the Stamp Act. However, the British government did pass the Declaratory Act in 1766, which declared that although they repealed the Stamp Act, they had the right to pass and enforce it if they wish. They said, "We govern you in all cases whatsoever." They also said that Parliament represents all Englishmen virtually, and so the colonists had virtual representation. Now, there's an obvious difference of opinion here. To fight over the Stamp Act showed that both sides disagreed as to where the power lay, and they were both going to be hard-headed on the issue. Here's the thing, the British should have simply offered them representation. There were not enough people in the colonies to give them anything but a small minority in the House of Commons. They had no lords, and so they would have had very, very little power anyway. Well, this crisis passed, but the problem was definitely not gone, and within a year, it was back. Well, when a man named Charles Townshend came into power in Britain, he passed what are known as the Townshend Duties. This is 1767. These were very heavy custom duties on things Americans loved, things like tea, lead, and paint. These were designed to earn revenue, not regulate trade. So in a way, these were similar to the Revenue Act of 1764. But the colonists didn't protest the Revenue Act. However, the colonists are not going to accept the Townshend Acts. And that's because by 1767, after all that with the Stamp Act, colonists were wary of anything and everything the British did. So within a year, the colonials said absolutely not, and they boycotted the items that were affected by the Townshend Duties. Now, the British held out for a little while. They stayed with the Townshend Duties until 1770, but the impact of colonial boycotting was strangling British trade and causing unemployment in England. So they gave up and they repealed the Townshend Duties in 1770. They repealed them on everything except one, except tea. They left this just out of principle. Now, by this time, the tension between the colonials and the British government had reached a peak that led to the Boston Massacre in 1770. The British government had soldiers in Boston to protect the custom collectors. To amuse themselves, colonials would yell and throw stuff at the soldiers. One time, a crowd of colonials grew fairly large and started throwing things like rocks and stones. So the British fired back onto the crowd and ultimately killed 5 people. The colonials played this off as the evil British government killing loyal, defenseless citizens. But this incident is significant in that it was important in making both sides realize that things were really getting out of hand. The British pulled their soldiers out of Boston altogether after this and allowed their soldiers to be tried for murder in an American court. The soldiers were defended by John Adams, who would become the 2nd president of the United States. And he did a great job defending them. They were all acquitted except for 2. 2 of them were convicted of manslaughter and were branded on their thumbs. Now, for 3 years after the Boston Massacre, the relationship between these 2 sides was fairly quiet until 1773. Then, in that year, Parliament passed the Tea Act of 1773. Now, the Tea Act was in no way meant to upset the colonists. It was actually passed to help a British manufacturing company known as the British East Indian Trading Company. This was a company in financial difficulty and whose biggest financial asset was tea. The Tea Act said that the grossly mismanaged company could send its tea directly to America without paying any custom duties. British tea merchants would thereby be able to undercut their colonial competitors. many of whom were smugglers who bought tea from the Dutch. So what this actually meant was that the price of tea in the colonies was going to be lower, because since the British East India Company wasn't paying custom duties on its tea, it would be able to sell the tea for cheaper than the colonists could sell their own tea. So it wasn't making tea more expensive, but colonists opposed this as a matter of principle. Colonials were outraged by the Tea Act, and there's a couple of reasons for that. First of all, they said it was a monopoly for the British East India Trading Company. And if Britain did this for one company, they might start doing it for others. And they were also still paying custom duties on tea from the Townshend duties. So they were just very angry about this. When the British East Indian Trading Company sent tea to the colonists would not let the ships be unloaded. In Boston, in 1773, a group of 16 colonials dressed as Indians went onto a ship and unloaded the tea overboard. This is called the Boston Tea Party. Now this time, the British government was convinced that the very existence of its empire was at stake, and it said it was the last straw. So England responded with a series of measures called the Coercive or the Intolerable Acts in 1774. Now there were 4 of these acts. The first one there, an act for the impartial administration of justice, that one said that trials of British officials would no longer take place in the colonies if a crime was committed in the colonies, but rather they would take place in England. The Boston Port Act closed the port of Boston until Boston had repaid the British East India Company for that lost tea. The Quartering Act allowed British troops to be housed in unoccupied buildings within the colonies. Now, this does not mean housed in colonist personal homes, but if they had a barn, right, or another outbuilding of some kind, British officers and soldiers could be housed there. Then the Massachusetts Government Act, it brought the Massachusetts government under control of the British rather than their general court. Well, these acts meant that colonists rallied to the cause of besieged Boston in particular, raising money, sending provisions, and boycotting as well as burning British tea. They also called a meeting of representatives from all the colonies together. The First Continental Congress met in 1774 at Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia to decide what to do about these coercive acts, these intolerable acts. 12 out of the 13 colonies sent representatives. Only Georgia did not. They adopted some really strong measures. They said the intolerable acts were unconstitutional under British law, and so they should not be obeyed. They said the colonists deserved the rights of Englishmen everywhere. They called for really strong economic sanctions throughout the colonies, in which they would not import anything from Britain at all. They even created a continental association of 7,000 men across the colonies that would oversee such boycotts. But finally, and this is important for us to note, 1774, the Continental Congress says, please, just let us go back to the way things were in the days of salutary neglect. Let us go back to 1763. And if so, everything would be okay. So again, they're not calling for independence yet, just for things to go back to the way they were. Well, when this got back to England, the demands of the First Continental Congress, the leadership of the British government would not have any part of it. In fact, King George III said, the New England governments are in a state of rebellion. Blows must decide. Well, this all turned to violence soon after. This all turned to violence at Lexington and Concord in 1775. These are in Massachusetts, right outside of Boston. The British heard that the colonials were stockpiling gunpowder and weapons at the city of Concord, and they knew some of the more notorious colonials were hanging out at Lexington. So Britain sent a few hundred troops to arrest some of these colonial leaders at Lexington, and then to go to Concord and destroy or confiscate the weapons and gunpowder. Well, colonial Minutemen, as they were called, which simply meant a bunch of farmers armed with guns, colonial Minutemen and British soldiers at Lexington fought on April 19th of 1775. This is called the Shot Heard Round the World. By the time they headed back toward Boston, by the time the British Army headed back toward Boston, news had spread, and there were farmers shooting at them from behind every bush, all the way back. The British military had around 300 soldiers killed, wounded, or missing by the time they got back to Boston. That's compared to less than 100 for the colonists. They picked, let me say that again. After the initial fighting, a Second Continental Congress met in 1775 and became essentially the colonial government. They picked George Washington to be commander-in-chief. And they decided to send diplomats abroad to get foreign aid. They also adopted an olive branch petition in 1775, directed to King George III. In this olive branch petition, they said that the colonists do not want war or rebellion. They said that they knew this wasn't the king's fault. Rather, they blamed Parliament. They asked the king to just step in and take them back to salutary neglect, take them back to 1763, and everything would be fine. Well, King George would not even look at the olive branch petition. Now, the significance of this is it showed that the colonials did not want to declare independence and would have been happy as late as 1775, remaining British citizens. In fact, they fought England for more than a year before announcing independence. And well into the American Revolution, George Washington and the other commanders would come back from fighting the British all day, and they would toast to the health of King George III. So the colonials are what we call reluctant revolutionaries. Now, the American Revolution was by no means inevitable. It could have been avoided if it were not for British intransigence or their refusal to compromise. They had ineffective leadership from King George III, and his close inner circle of yes men dominated the politics in England. The result of that was inconsistency and a stubborn inflexibility. When the conflict between the British Crown and American rights came to a point of confrontation, British leadership was wholly incapable of dealing with the colonists. Now, colonial motives for going to war with England were varied. Historians have pointed to excessive regulation, restrictions on selling Western lands, the tax burden, the mounting debts to British merchants, the lack of representation in Parliament. Also, there were individual motives depending on who you were. Some men, like John Hancock, who was one of the foremost smugglers in New England, he was a revolutionary for that very reason, right? He hated the Navigation Acts. Southern planters, many of them became revolutionaries because they were worried about the future of slavery under British control. And George Washington himself owned 60,000 acres of land west of the Appalachian Mountains, and he resented British efforts to restrict white settlement on the frontier. While each of these factors did contribute something to the collective grievances in America, the most important for all Americans was the issue of governance. The colonials had always governed themselves, and the British changed that system. So this was a strange revolution for multiple reasons. First of all, the objective was strange. The people who were fighting the revolution wanted things to stay the same as they had been before the British changed the old colonial system in 1763. England was the one that altered their working relationship, and the colonials kept saying, let's just go back to the way we used to be. Taxes were a major reason for fighting, as well as westward expansion. The colonists had always taxed themselves throughout the old colonial system, but the British changed that for reasons that seemed good to them and had some legitimacy in terms of paying for a war that the colonists had been partially responsible for. When the colonials responded with agitation and boycotts, both sides became entrenched. Conservatives are people that want things to stay the same, right? That want to conserve a system. Hence, it was a conservative revolution. Another interesting aspect of this revolution was that it was directed by the rich elite. Men like Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, George Washington. These were highly successful individuals. Benjamin Franklin was the most famous American, probably the richest person in America at the time. And George Washington, when we look at numbers today and we look at land, George Washington is still probably the wealthiest president we've ever had in the United States. Revolutions are supposed to be led by the poor, dumb masses, right? It's supposed to be an overthrow of the system. But instead, this is a conservative revolution led by the elite. This quote by Levi Preston sort of wraps up that issue of self-governance that the colonials felt was so incredibly important. Now, the American Revolution was a colonial rebellion or an insurgency. In order to put the insurrection down, the British sent 2/3 of their army, which was 56,000 soldiers, 1/2 of their navy, which was 171,000 sailors, and about 30,000 European mercenaries. This is along with some of the best generals they had. In contrast, the Continental Army had around 35,000 barely trained soldiers, 44,000 totally untrained militia, and 55,000 sailors. They were led by George Washington, a frontier fighter that had never commanded a unit larger than a regiment, which is about 400 to 500 people. So on paper, it was a no-brainer who was going to win this war. However, England was at an immediate disadvantage because they were fighting a counterinsurgency. So in order to win the war, Great Britain had to, number one, put down the colonial army. So they had to destroy the colonial army. And number two, they had to break the citizens' will to resist their domination. Also, because they were putting down a rebellion thousands of miles away, this was going to be ridiculously expensive. And they were already in massive debt from the French and Indian War. Furthermore, there were divisions within England as to whether it was even worth fighting in the first place. So what did the colonials have to do to win? Well, George Washington recognized that the only way to defeat the British was to wear them down in a prolonged war of attrition and exhaustion. He had to keep a military in the field and keep them there long enough for the public in Britain to get sick of the war and say, to hell with this, just let them go. This was going to be difficult, given the fact that the citizen soldiers lacked training and discipline, and the military had hardly any money. but it was still easier than what the British had to do. So basically, all Washington had to do to win the war was to not lose the war. So on June 15th of 1775, the Second Continental Congress named George Washington the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. When he was commissioned, just 2 days later, the Colonials and British forces engaged in their first major fight, known as the Battle of Bunker Hill. After Lexington and Concord, the two sides built up their forces in and around the hotbed of the Revolution, or the city of Boston. The majority of the battle actually took place at Breed's Hill, where the American forces fortified themselves on high ground overlooking Boston. But Bunker Hill was the original site chosen, and that name stuck. While under cover from their naval guns, 2,400 British troops marched toward the hill in blistering heat. They were dressed in their beautiful red, picturesque uniforms, which were totally impractical for this sort of thing. And because of their arrogance, they formed lines rather than columns, going against military strategy in routing an entrenched enemy. When the British soldiers came within 15 to 20 feet of the colonial militia, the defenders fired a round of gunfire at them, and sent the greatest military in the world running in panic. Well, when the British reformed and attacked again, they were once again repelled in the same way and sent into a frantic retreat. On the third assault, the Colonials, finally out of gunpowder, threw stones at them until the British ultimately ousted the Colonials by a bayonet charge. So ultimately, at the end of the day, the British took the hill, but they did it at a huge cost, over 1,000 casualties, including some of General Howe's aides. And that was compared with the colonial loss of 400 to 450. George Washington, who was on his way to Boston as the new commander, received news of this battle while he was still in New York. So the significance of the Battle of Bunker Hill is that it directly led to the Continental Congress recommending that all able-bodied men enlist in the militia, which would cause some divisions in the colonies. Now, throughout late 1775 and early 1776, in spite of actions by the British that demonstrated that peace was no longer a viable option, the Continental Congress and the American people held back from declaring independence. The revolutionary cause received a booster shot by Thomas Paine's Common Sense. Now, Thomas Paine was a radical Quaker originally from England who had only been in the colonies for 13 months when the war started. He was 39 years old and had been a perpetual failure in business and marriage, and yet he became the rhetorical voice of the American Revolution. Paine argued that the common sense of the matter required the colonials to declare independence. He attacked and blamed everything on King George III, calling him a royal brute. Until this pamphlet appeared, the squabble had been mainly with Parliament, and few colonists considered independence a viable option. But Paine directly attacked allegiance to the monarchy, which was the very last frayed connection to Britain, and he refocused the hostility that had been previously vented on Parliament. In early June of 1776, a resolution of independence was introduced in the Continental Congress. A 5-man committee was then put together to develop a public explanation of the reasons for colonial discontent and provide the rationale for autonomy. Some people say the Declaration of Independence was written by a committee. In addition to Thomas Jefferson, as you know, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Robert Livingston, and Roger Sherman were all on this committee. But a committee never wrote anything that good. Thomas Jefferson wrote it. The other members made minor revisions to it. The Declaration of Independence was officially adopted on July 2nd of 1776. Now we celebrate the 4th of July because that is when the Declaration of Independence was sent out to the public. I think this quote is great on this slide. King George III wrote in his diary on July 4th, "Nothing of importance happened today." What irony. So following the call for independence, the colonial effort looked incredibly bleak. At the end of August in 1776, Washington had more than 28,000 men under his command. By December of 1776, due to desertion and disease, he had only 3,000 men left. The Continental Army and the American effort were in desperate need of a morale booster, which Washington attained in two ways. First, one of the volunteers in the Army was, in fact, Thomas Paine. And on December 19th, he wrote a motivational piece that began with the immortal words, "These are the times that try men's souls." Washington ordered Paine's American Crisis to be read to every unit in the Continental Army, which did improve morale. More important for morale was Washington's desperate offensive in the winter of 1776. On December 25th, Christmas Day, George Washington led some 2,400 troops across the Delaware River to the Battle of Trenton, New Jersey, where the following night, Christmas night, he and the Continental Army surprised a garrison of German mercenaries called Hessians. There were 1,500 of them. In total, it was a total rout. It was a huge victory for the colonials. About 500 of the 1,500 Hessians escaped, but the other 1,000 were captured by the colonists. Only 6 or 7 Americans were killed or wounded. Although the victory was not in any way tactically significant, or really a defeat of British forces, it had an effect that was disproportionate to its size. By December 1776, many British and even Americans had thought the revolution was already on its way to being lost. So this was a morale victory for the Americans, and it galvanized the war effort and increased enlistment in the Continental Army. Now this picture is of Washington crossing the Delaware, and it's a beautiful and famous painting. It's totally inaccurate in its depiction. It was such an icy cold water. They all would have been hunkered down to stay warm, and the flag pictured there was not yet created, but it's still a beautiful depiction. Now, in order to win, the Americans needed foreign help, so they went to the French. Not necessarily because the French liked Americans, but because they hated the British. And the French would help the colonial effort from the beginning with loans and weapons. However, the French would not sign a treaty because they were not sure if the Americans had an actual chance of winning. Well, the battles of Saratoga in 1777 were the diplomatic turning point of the war. In September, the British sent 10,000 men, led by General John Burgoyne, down from Canada to split New England from the rest of the colonies. In this process, the army was spread too thin and ultimately had to surrender around 6,000 soldiers to the Americans on October 17th of 1777. When word of the British surrender reached the American diplomat to France, Benjamin Franklin, on December 4th, Benjamin Franklin said, "Now that we defeated the British, they are about to quit. If you want us to win, you better help us. This is what he said to the French. So the French alliance was signed in 1778, which said that both countries would fight until American independence was won, and that neither would conclude a peace agreement without the consent of the other. This also led to Spain entering the war as an ally to France, but not the United States. The French alliance ultimately bore fruit at Yorktown in 1781 in Virginia. The British army of approximately 8,000 under Lieutenant General Lord Cornwallis got itself in a box when it took a defensive position near the river at Yorktown. A combined French and American force of around 16,000, led by Washington, bombarded the British defensive position until Cornwallis asked for terms of surrender on October 17, 1781. Normally a British fleet would just come and pick them up, but a French fleet had actually managed to defeat the British fleet. When the Americans took the forces at the fort captive, the citizens back in England said, "This is enough. This war has gone on since 1775 and it's not worth it. Let's cut our losses." Yorktown was the last major land battle of the American Revolution. After this, the British government agreed to negotiate an end to the conflict. Ultimately, the Treaty of Paris, again, another Treaty of Paris, this time 1783, was signed by the British, the French, and the Spanish. Franklin negotiated terms that were extremely generous to the United States. The British recognized American independence, and the United States got all the land west to the Mississippi, north to Canada, and south to Florida. So to summarize, how did the world's greatest superpower, with the world's greatest military, lose to a bunch of hick farmers and their redneck leader, George Washington? Well, Washington only won 3 battles during the entire American Revolution. Every single conventional battle that he engaged the British head-on, he and the colonials lost. However, Washington was the perfect commander-in-chief because he was acutely aware of his shortcomings. He may not have known a lot about military strategy or tactics, but he knew to keep the fighting limited by staying the hell away from the British as much as he could. The British did not lose because the colonials were such amazing fighters and used guerrilla tactics. That has been way overblown in popular culture. But rather, the British lost because they failed at their major objectives. They failed to put the colonial army down, and they failed to break the citizenry's will to resist. And the British failed at these 2 objectives for 2 reasons. Both the British military and politicians completely and utterly failed in convincing the American population that they would be better off returning to the empire. In fact, they actually did the opposite. Also, a counterinsurgency is an incredibly difficult thing to do because it relies heavily on the targeted population acting a certain way, and it's hard to force people to act or think how you want. The British never fully understood the struggle they were engaged in, so they never formed a coherent strategy. Now, revolutions come in 3 forms historically. The first form of revolution is when you change the head of the government. This would be like the Glorious Revolution in England. The second form of revolution is when you change the form of government. Let's say go from a monarchy to a republic. The third is the most drastic, which is when you change all social and economic aspects, like when the lower class overthrows the leading classes. Most revolutions in history end up turning radical and bringing extreme changes. including killing off the people that began them, as in the Bolshevik Revolution and the French Revolution. So what changes did the American Revolution bring? Well, institutionalizing means looking at the tangible changes that were enacted. In the case of America, this means looking at things like the Declaration of Independence, the new state governments, and the Articles of Confederation. By looking at these, we can see how much change the Revolution actually brought. Now, the first place to look to understand the tangibles of the American Revolution is the Declaration of Independence. It was, in every sense of the word, propaganda. Now, propaganda does not mean lies. It just means truth told from one point of view. Jefferson was writing in a language that everyone in the world understood in order to gain support for the cause. As a matter of propaganda, it was so brilliant that it was recopied several times over in world history. Now, what kind of government did the Declaration of Independence call for? Well, monarchies derive their power from God and bestow it onto a king. But Jefferson said that governments are instituted among men, deriving their powers from the consent of the governed. So he was espousing a republican form of government, one created by men and deriving its power from them. Within a republican form of government, it can be more or less democratic depending on the system. It can be an aristocratic republic where only the rich elite property holders vote, or it can be a democratic republic where men and women of all races vote. Now, ideas of equality were also espoused, such as with the famous, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights." As we'll see, we don't have equality initially, right? These beautiful words of Jefferson have to be earned with time. Third, ideas of individuality. Jefferson said, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This was an unheard of philosophy for the time. John Locke had previously espoused ideas of life, liberty, and property. Now, Jefferson was an absolute individualist, and property is a zero-sum game, meaning that if one person owns something, another cannot. Whereas the pursuit of happiness is something everyone can look for in their own way. So this is the basis of American individuality. The United States was the first country to try and allow everyone to pursue their own happiness. Now, the Declaration of Independence was the most radical part of the entire revolution. It called for some radical changes to both the government and social ideals and brought about radical actions, such as pulling down King George III's statue. But what was it all worth? After all, Thomas Jefferson was a man who owned hundreds of slaves. So what did equality mean from a man like that? Well, the Declaration of Independence did not represent any sort of reality in the United States when it was written. However, it did represent ideals that our country is still striving for to this day. In those days, only white, land-owning, intelligent adult males were considered equal. However, from then until now, equality is something we have striven for. The drive throughout all of U.S. history has been to reach the goal of truly having all people created equal and having that equality be practical. Now, the Continental Congress created a new national government under the Articles of Confederation in 1781. The Articles of Confederation were the first constitution of the United States. Now, the Articles went into effect in March of 1781, and they did little more than legalize the status quo. They created a very weak national government. This was done because the problem before had been the oppressive big government under the monarchy. So the Articles of Confederation were very reactionary. They were not thought through very well. So under the Articles, there were certain powers. The Articles of Confederation had the power over foreign affairs, had the power over questions of war and peace. They could decide disputes between the states, and they had responsibility for the government of the Western territories. But in general, there were more weaknesses than powers. So in the Articles, there was no chief executive, no president, not really. There was no national court system, so every state would interpret the laws the way it wanted, which meant there was no consistency. There was no power of taxation. So the national government was supposed to fight wars without the ability to raise money. There was no power to regulate interstate or foreign commerce. So tariffs and custom duties also were done state by state, so no consistency in commerce either. To enact legislation, 9 states had to approve measures dealing with war, and in order to change the Articles, and this is a huge weakness, perhaps the biggest weakness, unanimous consent from all of the states was required. So 13 out of 13 states had to agree. You can only imagine how often they ever agreed on anything. Now, despite these weaknesses, the Confederation government represented the most pragmatic structure for the new nation, because the war had yet to be won when these were put in place. And America's statesmen could not risk the prolonged and divisive debates over the distribution of power that other forms of government would have provoked. So the Articles of Confederation connected the states, but in a really weak way. There was essentially no federal government. This document was incredibly conservative in that it kept the states the same as they had been before the Revolution, but now without a king. They created the government this way because they had just gotten away from a monarchy in Britain. Because the federal government did not have any power, all of it was left to the states. And in the states, it was in the legislature, which was elected by the people. So in a way, this created more democracy because the legislature was closer to the people. So with independence, every colony had to become a state. And by 1780, all had created their own state constitutions. Every state had a republican government, meaning they had representative legislatures, and there were no hereditary positions. They put nearly all power in the hands of the state legislature, because during the colonial period, the assemblies had been their best friends. Now, political revolutions and war usually spawn other kinds of upheaval. So what kind of social and economic reforms did the American Revolution bring about? What changes were brought to the state level? Well, because the new state constitutions put all the power in the legislature, this did advance democracy. In some states, any male taxpayer could vote instead of just property owners. However, no state adopted universal male suffrage or allowed women or non-whites to vote. Still, it was more democratic in the sense that the legislature was closest to the people who could vote. The revolution also set in motion a transition from the toleration of religious dissent to a complete freedom of religion in the separation of church and state. At the outset of the war, just about every state had an established church to which everyone had to pay taxes. Before the end of the American Revolution, all but Virginia had eliminated tax support for the Anglican Church. In fact, in 1786, Virginia created a statute for religious freedom. This was written by Thomas Jefferson and was one of his proudest achievements. So there was some religious change, but not totally. It did depend on the state, but there's still a move toward more freedom. The revolutionary generation of leaders was the first to confront slavery and to consider abolishing it. During the war, only 2 states, South Carolina and Georgia, refused to allow blacks to serve in the military. Although only about 5,000 mostly free blacks served out of the 300,000 men who served, some slaves did too, and in doing so won their freedom and even land bounties. In contrast, however, the British emancipated tens of thousands of slaves during the war. Every one of the colonies had slaves before the American Revolution. But during this period, all of the colonies from Pennsylvania north abolished slavery outright or put it on the path to ending. And every colony in the South kept slavery. In the South, anti-slavery sentiment went no further than a relaxation of the manumission laws which allowed owners to free their slaves. What about women? Well, before and after the war, women could not vote, could not preach, could not hold office, or if married, could not legally own property, including clothes. They had no rights to their children. So for women, hardly anything changed for them. New governments needed the support of all their citizens, so the idea of Republican motherhood meant having a lot of children to create more citizens. This quote you see here is by Abigail Adams. She wrote this to her husband and asking him to, remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than their ancestors had been. Well, in response to that plea, John Adams wrote to his wife, "Depend upon it, we know better than to repeal our masculine systems." And Thomas Jefferson said the tender breast of ladies were not formed for political convulsion. So no change for women happened at this point. So overall, there were some important social and economic reforms, but not enough to bring drastic changes. Therefore, the American Revolution is the second level of revolution, changing the form of government. They changed from a monarchy to a republic. The American Revolution can be interpreted as conservative. The system worked well until 1763, when the British tried to change the system with new taxes and regulations. They felt they had good reason to do this. But the colonials had taxed themselves up until this time, and they weren't willing to let that power go. This revolution was led by the rich, wealthy elites who wanted things to return to the way they had been. Because the revolution started for conservative reasons, it did not bring about radical changes. Some colonies, in particular in the North, did get rid of slavery. Some states also got rid of their established church, but others did not. So the American Revolution was not a social and economic revolution. The most radical part of it was the Declaration of Independence. It changed the government from a monarchy to a republic and said insane things like all men are created equal and the role of government is to protect life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The Declaration of Independence set a lot of ideals that this country is still striving to attain to this day. So in 1783, the United States was a new republic in a world full of monarchies. It had succeeded in gaining independence, but not because it was militarily brilliant. Because they put in governmental structures at the state and national level were incredibly weak. In 1783, the country was very feeble and insecure with itself. And in our next lecture, we'll talk about the change from the Articles of Confederation unto a stronger national constitution.